You're listening to the Valley Current.
Steve, welcome into the Valley Current. How have you been?
I've been great. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, I see your picture there with the suit and tie on. Are you getting formal these days?
I must be. This time, something popped up on my screen, presumably from Zoom, on my non-video computer, saying Jack Russo is inviting me into a meeting.
Right. Well, this is the time I wanted to spend a few minutes talking to you about this latest attempt to get Trump's tax returns to Congress. He's lost in the district court. He's lost in the Court of Appeal. Now he's petitioned for certiorari in the U.S. Supreme Court with a request for a stay to Justice Roberts, because Justice Roberts is the applicable circuit judge for the D.C. Circuit, which is where the Court of Appeals rejected Trump's bid for a stay. And Justice Roberts granted the stay. And you're the tax expert, so maybe we spend a few minutes on confidentiality of federal tax returns, because Trump has used this for years to argue that, hey, he doesn't think he has to release tax returns because A, they're confidential, and B, they're always under audit. And he's used that repeatedly for what seems like a very long period of time.
Yes, he has. And you realize the real victim here. And it's not just you and I as taxpayers, but poor Melania. She's dragged into this through not much doing of her own.
Oh, assuming that she's filing jointly as a married couple filing jointly, which is what most people who are married do, right?
I would assume, yes.
I mean, there's typically good practical financial reasons for doing it that way, isn't there? Aren't there?
There are, and I'd say the chief among them being that if you were to file married filing separately, you have a much higher chance of being audited.
Why is that?
Well, you need to reconcile the allocation of income and expenses between the two spouses. And if the two spouses or their preparers reconcile it differently or omit a reconciliation, then depending upon how the IRS feels on that day, they may or may not give you a buy.
Right. So your point is there's potential for inconsistency when it's a married couple, but they're filing separately, because the implication is perhaps somebody doesn't trust the other spouse for one reason or another, and there's some other funny business going on, right?
Yes, and the complexity just escalates exponentially. I was just in tax court with a client, and the former spouse, reported a different amount of alimony unbeknownst to my client. And the IRS came in and said, first of all, we're going to audit you. And there's, $5,000 or $10,000 in expense off the top.
Right.
And because you've reported a different amount and you haven't kept completely detailed records of your alimony payments, in fact, you were paying third parties on behalf of the ex-spouse without completely meticulous records proving the purpose of the payments, we're therefore going to give you a zero deduction for alimony. We're not going to match your deduction to what she paid tax on. We're going to reduce it completely to zero.
Wow.
And that's completely unfair. Completely unfair.
Well, this sounds like a divorced or divorcing couple, right? And they filed separate. They filed separately in like the last year of their marriage, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And typically, there are situations where we do recommend filing separately, but there's not too many of them. They're few and far between due to both the complexity and the audit risk of filing separately. And so because of that audit risk factor, I'd assume that Trump's getting back to their situation, file jointly.
Right. I mean, the interesting part, of course, is California is a community property state. So all earnings are presumed to be community property of the couple, unless they have a prenuptial agreement that declares otherwise, or they have some other type of agreement that declares otherwise. So the typical view for a married couple in California in a traditional marriage or traditional marital situation is it's all community property. It's all sort of batched together, just like it's one partnership, co-owned, co-equally owned. And so Florida is a little different. That's where the Trumps live. That's their principal residence, I guess, is Mar-a-Lago. It's not a community property state. But I think the general position, for the reasons you gave, remains that a married couple will file jointly. And your point from the outset was, well, all this stuff involves mostly him and mostly probably his premarital separate assets, or a substantial number of premarital separate assets. And she's kind of dragged along with respect to all those details, otherwise not being public, now presumably sooner or later, depending on what the U.S. Supreme Court does, becoming public information, right?
Yeah. And it's really through no fault of her own. I mean, here she is living happily. I'm not sure if they actually still sleep together.
Yeah, they probably have separate wings of Mar-a-Lago. It's a pretty big estate. But their point is they probably don't talk about business matters like as though they're co-equal partners or that they're partners at all, right?
So here she is living happily in Connecticut or New York or in her separate wing.
Yeah.
And what has she done to deserve having her taxes be public?
Right. And that's where I wanted to go, which is traditionally in California, tax returns get a special evidentiary privilege, not absolute, but sort of presumed that in civil discovery, and probably even to some degree in criminal discovery, unless it's really highly relevant, the courts essentially uphold a privilege, like a privacy privilege, applicable to federal and state tax returns. And I think that's probably generally true throughout the United States, although that's what I was interested in knowing. In the parlance of IRS practice, does everyone generally recognize that tax returns are confidential, or do people that are IRS audit people just like treat them like they're public information?
IRS audit people are required to keep taxes confidential. And I believe that there's statutory provisions that taxes are confidential. However, I believe I have heard a rumor that if we can prove a need to know, there's a potential for discovery in court.
Right. It requires a stronger showing than just the typical relevance and or likely to lead to relevant evidence standard that applies in discovery generally. So it's kind of a last resort thing if a defendant or a plaintiff or whoever the discovery is targeted at refuses to open up their books, you know, their regular books, their regular financial books, their QuickBooks, whatever you want to call their accounting records pertaining to matters relevant in the lawsuit, it's possible that the court will say, well, you don't have any other source, so we're just going to go to your tax returns and use those to presumably draw income and expense data from. Now, obviously, there may not be a perfect alignment between the financial records and what's in tax returns, but generally speaking, people are required to file tax returns, and they do. And so there's a source of some financial data there if the other books and records are missing or incomplete or otherwise can't yield an answer. But in the case of Trump, he's been arguing for a long time that this is a politically motivated way to discredit him. And everyone sort of knows that the ultimate insinuation is he makes a lot of money and he doesn't really pay much, if anything, in the way of taxes. And so he either has the most brilliant tax strategist on his team, legally taking advantage of just about every potential angle that one could humanly imagine, or he's actually engaged in some type of illegal tax avoidance that would presumably paint him as less than patriotic in the eyes of any future voter in the 2024 election, should he decide to run again for president. So his view is it's all politically motivated and has nothing to do with the oversight role that Congress has, because this was a congressional subpoena that's seeking that information that is really part of this bigger January 6th review of things that happened leading up to the attack on the Capitol. And it's probably an ancillary proceeding, but it's all sort of coming out of the District of Columbia and designed to get kind of a fuller picture of where did money go and how was it recorded and what was it used for and so on. So it's just more data in what must be at this point millions, if not tens of millions of pages of records that have been generated from this investigation. When and whether there'll be a full-length movie about all this is left to the imagination. But he succeeded in the latest pitch to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think that's noteworthy because I believe a lot of people thought there's no way the Supreme Court would want to touch this. And Justice Roberts is now viewed as kind of a middle-of-the-road justice. So maybe he really wants this to be something that comes up for vote. He just needs 4 votes, and he's recently appointed 3 of the 4 justices that would vote, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. Presumably those 3 justices might go his way. And then the question is, would Thomas join as a 4th? Of course, Thomas's wife is implicated in text messages in connection with this entire investigation. So whether he should actually disqualify himself is directly or indirectly raised. But if he gets 4 votes, then the stay will become a lengthy stay, and the tax returns won't get delivered probably for some number of months or years until there's an actual decision by the Supreme Court in reviewing the ultimate separation of powers question that's raised. So it's interesting to see how far someone could potentially go to stop information from making its way into the hands of the public. Because I think once Congress gets it, the odds are that it's going to get leaked, or maybe it's just going to get published, either on their Freedom of Information Act request or some other request. But normally tax return information is not published, right?
You raise a whole lot of interesting issues. And one of them is just the fairness of the overall tax system. And the question of should somebody who is wealthy enough to have their name on large buildings be paying more than 0 tax?
Right. Should a billionaire, put differently, should a billionaire who probably makes tens of millions of dollars of income off of those assets be able to make that kind of income without paying applicable federal and state taxes under, whether you call it alternative minimum tax, or in California, we have a millionaire's tax, right? Doesn't the California rate go up once someone has income above a certain number? Is it above $1 million, or there's some special millionaire's tax in California, isn't there?
There are California state taxes on very high income individuals.
Right. Isn't it like an extra point or two if your income is above $1 million, something like that?
I think it's a little more complicated than that, but yes.
And so, clearly Trump wouldn't want to live in California. I think ultimately he didn't want to live in New York, because New York is also a high tax state. It's got a city tax, county tax, a state tax, I mean, a lot of taxes in New York, maybe even more than even in California, maybe the highest of all of them. And Florida is a no tax state. And so it's just a federal tax return. There's no Florida state tax return.
Let me put out two responses, one of which is that our tax system is based on annual income, not based upon overall wealth.
Right.
But even though we do have a handful of different taxes under different names, so we have an estate tax that happens when every generation or perhaps every second generation passes away. And that is more on overall wealth. But the focus in general on what's commonly our focus today being income tax, not sales tax or payroll tax, which is particularly interesting because payroll tax is regressive rather than progressive. So you find that low-income people are paying more payroll tax than high-income people as a portion of their income. I think the second thing really is on the compliance with the taxes and whether he was deliberately cheating or conducting an illegal tax evasion, or whether he was just taking advantage of loopholes or competent tax advocates. So if criminality was found upon examination of these taxes, either by Congress or by the New York officials and New York prosecutors who already have access to several years of his income tax returns, would they be able to refer the criminality to the Justice Department?
Yeah, I think so. I think she's already done it. You make a good point. There's a parallel New York State case that was brought against the Trump organization, not him individually, but essentially against the corporation that's called the Trump organization, that's mainly a real estate firm. And, they were able to essentially get a conviction by plea agreement from the CFO of that organization, who, as part of the plea agreement, was required to agree to testify in that case, the criminal tax fraud case against the entity, in which obviously the state tax returns are relevant evidence and must be being dissected and sliced and diced left, right, and sidewards. In that case, the complaint is I think I sent it to you, something like 120 pages. And it seems to me that on the very first press release or very first press conference, the head attorney in that case said, we're referring this as well to the Justice Department because we think there's also been a violation of federal law. So obviously, whatever comes out of this trial, I'm sure there's a number of federal prosecutors that might be sitting in the gallery of that trial and basically watching what happens. Now, the interesting thing I think that happened today or yesterday was one of the witnesses ended up coming down with COVID. And so they suspended the trial until presumably that witness gets well enough to show back up into the courthouse. So there's, like one complication after another, one delaying event after another. And, it's got to be circus central inside whatever war room the Trumps have for managing all this litigation, because it's going on in the federal courts, it's going on in the appellate courts, it's going on in Congress. I mean, it's got to be something that when all is said and done, it must be shortening his lifespan, certainly his health span, because there's so many balls up in the air, any one of which can explode or implode at any point in time. And I really can't imagine that he gets a lot of great sleep at night. But look, one of his colleagues is in a criminal case in New York that I think will soon go to the jury, this guy, Tom Barrack. Of course, his personal lawyer, Cohen, ended up getting convicted and serving a couple of years in prison and then wrote a book about it. This Trump presidency, and I guess the whole Trump era, if you want to call it that, is probably producing more books, tapes, videos, you name it, than just about anything that's ever happened in any previous president, even dating back to George Washington. So it's quite an interesting story. And I imagine someone's going to teach a tax course or an advanced tax course if the Trump organization wins on the strategies that they used and how they were successful in winning. Of course, the same could be true if they lose. And then the question is what actually happens as a remedy against the organization, and then maybe ultimately as to the degree it spawns other lawsuits. But I have to believe that part of it, of this whole blocking of the congressional subpoena, is very much tied into the embarrassment factor that will play out going into what would otherwise be the startup of the 2024 campaign. Because typically these campaigns get started a couple of years before the election, and basically we're at the midterm, so we're within the mark of the 24-month period that leads up to the presidential elections, the next presidential elections, right?
Jack, I'm the wrong person to ask because I never thought Trump would be elected president in 1,000 years to begin with.
Right. It's a long shot. I'm sure he was surprised too.
Now, as an attorney, would you take some amount of money to join forces with that circus?
I tell you, I think it's very hard because I've read a lot of Bob Woodward's books, and I've listened to his Bob Woodward's, I don't know, it's about 12 hours of taped conversations with Donald Trump. He's just released all of them, and Simon & Schuster issued the audiobook. And I've listened to that. I've listened to parts of it twice as I've ridden my bike during my morning exercise routine. And I have to tell you, there's a lot of information in what might be called the audio version of what other people would read in a transcript that really suggests that he engages in decision-making in ways that are completely, I don't want to say irrational, but completely emotional. And he bases things on intuition as opposed to weighing all the relevant factors. Maybe some of that has served him in business and in life. I think some of it has disserved him. I think some immense mistakes were made with Putin that we're now seeing some of the consequences of. I think some immense mistakes were made in North Korea that we may see the consequences of. I think some immense mistakes were made with China that we are going to see the consequences of. So, I have a hard time imagining somehow getting emotionally aligned with someone who to me just seems very, very, very challenging as a client, very challenging as an individual. I don't know how those lawyers are doing it. I would assume there's all kinds of buffers between him and those lawyers, and a lot of stuff gets filtered. And this is for those lawyers kind of an intellectual challenge. That's what I would guess most of those lawyers would say. Now, on the other hand, it just could be a paycheck. And I can't really say that I would ever do something for just a paycheck. I think that's the difference between a profession and an occupation. You make choices about who you represent, why you represent them, how you feel about representing them. But, on the whole, he's entitled to the most zealous representation that he can find. He's obviously got a big team of lawyers. They're doing stuff that's generating some success. They've been partially successful in the courts in Florida. They were not successful at all in the courts in D.C. until they got to the Supreme Court. And I'm sure he's pretty happy about Justice Roberts' stay. But the reason for talking about it is it's very timely. And I think for a lot of people, they just don't really understand tax return information and kind of what happens to it and how it could potentially become subject to subpoenas that result in production of information and the like. It's not absolutely privileged. It's not something that, like an attorney-client privilege, the attorney is supposed to go to the grave not waiving or disclosing attorney-client privileged information, with several exceptions not relevant here. But in general, it is an area that I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate or comprehend. So you've been doing this for quite a while, and I would assume, the last question I have is, I would assume that whenever you get prior tax return information from a client, you're statutorily and ethically bound to maintain the confidentiality, just like we would as attorneys. That's just baked into being a professional as a CPA, right?
That is correct. There is a professional guarantee of a confidentiality. However, as you mentioned, there are several exceptions. So a court can subpoena tax information from me. And in that case, I have the duty in my engagement agreement to notify the client so that they can obtain legal representation to potentially fight the...
Right. I think that's actually what happened to the tax firm that was in the middle of this. I think they got a subpoena as well. And they just said, look, we don't have any dog in this fight. We'll turn things over to where they have to be turned over, but we want to make sure the Trump organization and the Trumps themselves have the ability to be heard and to fight whatever fight they want to fight legally. We're just kind of an intermediary trying to do our job. Now, of course, there are also instances where tax firms have their computers hacked and then the information just spills out, as occurred with those Panama Papers. Although I haven't really seen or heard that there was much of a roar of audits or criminal investigations or anything from all that data that spilled out. I think a couple of professors did write up some analysis of all the different ways very wealthy people take advantage of the tax system, but I don't know that there were ever any convictions or even criminal charges that resulted from people getting access to all that information and deciding to sort of look at what was out there, right?
You know, Jack, the technology I have on my desk is 10 times better than the technology that an IRS auditor has on his or her desk.
The security technology or the technology to analyze a return?
And the technology overall for both purposes.
Oh, okay, why is that? Why is that?
The IRS has been underfunded for many years, and they're still operating on software that was written in COBOL in the 1960s, 1970s.
Okay, so you're saying they basically are not in the 21st century from a computational intelligence point of view, but they'll probably get there because there was some big allocation of new budgetary resources for them.
Yes, there was.
Administration, right?
I'm not sure the cash has actually arrived yet, but on my day-to-day dealings with IRS, they do not have an actual copy of the tax return that we negotiate about, and they have to ask me to fax them a copy of the tax return so that they can work with me.
Wow.
All they have is a very limited information extracted transcript.
Wow.
So
that's kind of wild. So that's like a form of super security to the tax return itself, which is
that after 10 years, it's gone. It's in microfilm.
Microfilm. So which could be a good thing, I suppose, to some degree, because it's less likely to get hacked and less likely to make its way into some sort of Panama files dump, right?
Your chances of being audited for something that's more than 10 years old by the IRS.
Tell the audience how they can reach you, because you've been very helpful on a topic that is very current and I think is something that's newsworthy. How would people reach you?
Always a pleasure, Jack. srabin at srabin.com. That's spelled S for Steve, R-A-B as in Bravo, I-N.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for your help. Have a good time. We'll talk again next week, perhaps, okay?
Indeed. You be
Take
well.
care. Sure. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.